Welcome to the Young Widow podcast, and thank you for joining me today for episode 6, The Little Things No One Talks About, part 1, The Death Certificate. I'm Britany, your host, and I'm happy that you could join me today. I know that we haven't chatted in about 2 weeks because I've been on vacation with my daughter, and I'm just getting caught up now. Actually, the last time we spoke, we wanted to talk this week about the year of the first. But with my recent travel, it sparked a topic that I wanted to talk about that I felt like was more relevant to my current emotional state today. And I encountered some issues on travel. So I wanted to talk about the death certificate, focus on the emotions around the death certificate and the instances in which you can need the death certificate, which is something that I wasn't aware of in young widowhood and my early active grieving stage. So let's get started. When my husband died, I knew I would need a certificate of death, but I didn't know how emotional that process would be for me. I want to go through my process and what happened to me with getting the death certificate, kind of what I went through initially, and talk you through that just to give you an idea of what I went to in comparison to maybe what you went through or what you could go through. The whole process started with me sitting at the funeral home with the funeral director. He was explaining the certification process to me and that a death certificate would be issued by the county of clerks in about 10 days. I would get a call and that I would need to go pick up the death certificate. And I had a choice. My choice was pick up the death certificate at the funeral home or to pick up the death certificate at the county of clerk's office. I chose to do it at the county clerk's office because for me, at that point in time, I never wanted to step foot in the funeral home again. It was the place of my worst nightmare. It was the place of the realization that my husband is dead, where everybody came to pay their respects to him and to our family. So I told the funeral director that when they called the funeral home to let me know, and then I would head up to the county of clerk's office to get the certificate. And I remember thinking to myself in that moment, sitting there, that it didn't hit me on how big of a deal the death certificate would be. And just that once I had it, I could finally start dealing with all the people that were calling my phones and closing out my husband's accounts because I was his executor. And there was nothing I could do without a certificate of death. Thinking about the death certificate really didn't cross my mind again until it did when I got that phone call about 2 weeks later. So one morning my phone rang and it was the funeral home telling me that the death certificates were ready to be picked up. And as I heard those words through the phone, my heart sank. My stomach immediately felt heavy and I couldn't believe the words, "The death certificate is ready." But I knew that I had to go get it. All of a sudden I didn't want to go and I couldn't just stomach the idea of it. But with no choice, I got in the car, and the county clerk's office was about 45 minutes from my house. And I remember the feeling the whole way there that I was anxious and nervous and sick. And I was anxious because I didn't know what to expect. Would I break down when I got there? Would they make me say that I was his widow? Or would they just hand me the paperwork quietly and I would go on my way? I didn't want to see their faces of pity. I didn't want to see them feel bad for me. I knew that I emotionally couldn't stomach it only about 2 weeks into my grief. And so the whole drive there was just this overwhelming feeling of being anxious and nervous because I didn't know what was going to happen. And I didn't have anybody to ask. So I got there and I walked into the office. And as soon as I checked in, the secretary at the desk stood up and she asked me what she could help me with. And surprisingly, the words just rolled off my tongue. I said, "I'm here to pick up my husband's death certificate." She just looked at me for a brief second, asked for my ID, and then went and grabbed a manila folder out of a little box and came back. As I saw her with that manila folder, I had racing thoughts through my head. And those thoughts were, there it is. That's the death certificate. Is she just going to hand me this? I'm going to be able to walk away. Like, I don't want to have any confrontation right now. And I could feel my emotions already surging through my body. And then she opened the folder. And on the inside, I couldn't believe she was opening the folder. Why was she opening up the death certificates here? Did she know what kind of pain she was about to cause me? And she said, "You need to verify the death certificate, ma'am, before you can sign for them, because if any information is correct, you'll have to go through the process again." And I just stood there for a second in disbelief. You mean I have to verify these? I have to stand here in front of you and go through the death certificate to verify my husband's information? And she was like, "Yes, you do." And I couldn't believe that I was going to have to do that right then and there. I immediately felt my eyes filling with tears and I was like, okay. And I sat there and I did it. I went through every line of that death certificate. But what got me most was the box that said date and time of death. And when I got to that box, I froze and I just looked at it And my brain raced through the thought over and over again. I just kept reading it and rereading it, and I couldn't believe it. Here it was. This was the death certificate, and it was one thing to see my husband's name on it, but it was another thing to see his day and time of death on it, and then that it was certified. I couldn't comprehend what I was reading. I finished the certification. I told her it was good, packed them up in the manila folder, and went on my way. And I remember crying as I walked to my car, crying as I drove home, because that moment made it real. It was the proof he was dead. Mind you, I had already been to the funeral home. We had already had a memorial service. Friends and family had already came into town. Did I lay over my husband's dead body crying and begging for him to come back to life? Yes, I did. But the most real moment for me that my husband had died was verifying his death certificate. And it not only made it real to me, it was the point that now it was real to the world. Now all those people that called my phone and sent things in the mail that wanted proof of his death had a document from the government stating that he had in fact died. And for me, that was a huge emotional trigger. It was the opposite of the birth certificate. It was the end. I never knew, aside from getting a birth certificate when you're born, that when you die, you get a certificate when you die. I guess I never had thought about it. And it was the government saying, this person no longer exists. And that was it. It was probably one of the most emotional days, aside from the day he died and his funeral and memorial service, that I had experienced in my early grief. I had no idea that it would be that emotional because nobody told me. I had nobody to ask, and there was nobody to walk me through it. And even though somebody could have walked me through it, I still would have been just as emotional, but at least maybe I felt like I would have been a little bit more prepared, which is why I'm doing this podcast. So that's a little bit about my story the day I received the death certificates for my husband. Now I want to talk a little bit about what you need it for, because if you are super early in your grieving stage, then you may not know this. If you weren't the executor, you may not know everything it was used for. But then also, if you're not a widow listening to this, it's something that you can plan for in the future, unfortunately. If you're an executor of an estate like me, you basically need a death certificate for everything. Every account I had to close, they wanted a certified copy of the death certificate. We're talking about removal from phone accounts, removal from bank accounts, insurance, credit cards, utilities, even the deed to my house. I literally needed the death certificate for everything. And because I needed it for everything, the death certificate and carrying it around actually became pretty normal for the first 6 to 8 months in my early widowhood phase. I carried a folder around that I had in my mind labeled the death folder, and within it was the manila folder with, at any given time, 7 to 10 copies of his death certificate that were certified, so I could just hand them out to anybody that needed them, so I could take care of the legal aspect of our lives. So slowly, after the first 6 to 8 months, it started to die down. I had gone through all of the accounts, all of our bank accounts, and I was just very determined, working off a list, which if you know me, you know how that works, and just closing everything out. I needed death certificates less and less, and eventually got to a point where I rarely needed the manila folder, and I took it out of the death folder and put it within the safe. And I really didn't think about the death certificates a lot from there until I did. And the moments I didn't involve me and my life with my husband anymore because I had taken care of all of that. The moments involved my daughter because we had had a child together. And everything I did for her that required 2 parents' signatures, they wanted to know why there wasn't a father's signature. And there wasn't because he had died. And so I needed proof that he had died. And so I had to provide that. And so what are some of the things I needed it for? A passport for my child. 3 years after he died, I had to go to the safe and get the death certificate out. And it was a whole event having to hold it in my hands again. Investment accounts my husband was on for my daughter's college, I had to go get the death certificate out. Withdrawing my daughter from school to re-enroll her in another school, I had to get the death certificate out. And eventually it came to that point where I only needed it for things that involved her, but it was so sporadic that it didn't become normal to hold the death certificate. So while she had gotten a passport 3 years after he died, pulling that death certificate out of the safe was a complete reemergence of emotions from the early active grieving phase. Withdrawing her from her school and needing the death certificate was a whole reemergent of the early active grieving phase, because it had been months and 2 years from me holding that piece of paper. And every time I pulled it out, I would feel a pit within my stomach, because here it was. Here's the paper again. This says that he is dead. That actually leads into my next story of what happened to us most recently, which is why I decided to have this podcast today. So my daughter and I were just on vacation and we traveled out of the country. I had a passport for my daughter. In order to get the passport, I had used the death certificate, provided it to the government, and they gave me the passport. But I wasn't aware that I was going to need it for the specific country we were traveling to. So we landed in Central America. We got off the plane. We got to customs and immigrations, and it was our turn up next. The lady asked us to move forward. We came up to her, and she quickly said, "Is it just the two of you traveling?" And I looked at her and I said, "Yes, it is myself and my daughter. Here are our passports." I handed her our passports, and she looked at them for a couple of seconds. And then she point blank looked at me and said, "Where is her father?" And I said, "Excuse me?" She said, "Where's her father?" Me, feeling unreal that this is being asked 4 years after he died, very coldly looked at her and said, "He's dead." And she said, "Can you prove it?" "Excuse me? You want me to prove that my husband is dead? Because why?" She said, "Because you need authorization to travel with her alone." I said, "What do you mean? She is my child. I have her passport. Her dad is dead and I can't call him. What do you want me to do?" And she looked at me and said, "We want you to get the death certificate and prove that he is dead before we allow you into our country." It was completely unreal. I could not believe what was happening. 4 years later, how did I miss this? And why am I being asked to start off my vacation by providing the death certificate for my husband? People were walking by with kids and nobody was questioning them because a man and a woman were together with children. So it was assumed they were their parents. But because I was a woman traveling alone with a child, who also, if you know my daughter, looks nothing like me because my husband was Hispanic and I am Irish. But because I was a woman traveling alone with my daughter, I needed to prove that he was dead. When I called my best friend while we were stuck in immigrations, I was crying. Tears were running down my face. And I said, "I need you to go to my safe. I need you to go to my house right now. And I need you to provide me a copy of Stephen's death certificate because they are denying us access to this country and we are stuck in immigrations. Also, I need you to take photos of it. I need you to send me all this information so we can get through this process and get this over with." And when the images came through from here, it was complete overwhelming sadness and emotions because here was the death certificate again that I hadn't seen in 2 years. And now I have it on my phone and I'm forced to go show it to somebody. And it was like reliving my early stages of grief again, even years later. To see this document that certifies my husband is dead, it still evokes huge emotion. So why do I tell you all of this? It's been over 4 years. And apparently I still needed the death certificate in an instance that I had no idea I would need the death certificate for. Overall, I imagine that my use of the death certificate isn't over because of my daughter. I will likely need to use it through the time that she's in college, even though the portion of his in my life is likely closed out with the death certificate. And I also imagine that my feelings and my emotions around the death certificate will never be dulled or go away. It's one of those things in grief that immediately brings it all back when you see it. The early days, the initial loss, the overwhelming feeling of loneliness. If you are new on this grief journey, I wanted to have this episode so that way somebody talked to you about it. So that way you understood what type of feelings you may feel around the death certificate, but so that way you also know that it is normal and it validates the way that you feel. Because there are a lot of widows that feel the same way whenever they see the death certificate of their spouse. Well, this episode isn't going to change the way that you feel about it, but it's at least going to give you the preparation that you need in order to know that is potentially going to be a trigger for you. So with that, thank you for joining me this week. I apologize again for being out the last 2 weeks. And we're going to dive into deep emotions again next week and talk about more unexpected things that could be triggering in your grief, like grocery shopping or the mail that keeps coming in. So I hope that you have the best week that you can, and we'll see you next week.